The proceed.
Sure. Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is the first oral evidence session of the committee's new Defending Democracy inquiry. The first panel will look at the evolving risks to democracy, including from foreign interference, and how these risks can be addressed. The second panel will consider the role of emerging technologies and what role the media and regulators play in countering challenges such as disinformation. Today's final panel will then focus on risks to the election process and the Electoral Commission's work to ensure the UK's electoral integrity. So please can I ask the witnesses to the first panel to introduce themselves. I see we've got Professor Cormac in front of us.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me this afternoon. It's a privilege to be here. My name is Rory Cormac. I'm Professor of International Relations at the University of Nottingham.
You're very welcome indeed, Professor Cormac. We have virtually Pamela San Martin, who is a board member of the Oversight Board for Meta, and Pamela is with us virtually. You're very welcome to our committee this afternoon.
Thank you, Secretary, and very, very honored to be here and with Professor Cormac. I am, in fact, part of the Oversight Board that was created by Meta, and prior to that, I was part of the Mexican electoral management body. And just to tell the committee, my native language is Spanish, so if I stutter a bit in English, please excuse me from beforehand.
Of course, your English is fantastic. Right. Perhaps I can kick off then by saying, what do you both see as the greatest risk to the UK's democracy today? Perhaps I can start with Professor Cormac.
Thank you. I think the greatest threat to democracy today comes to our elections. I think it's right that we're focusing on elections in this election year, but I think that the bigger threat isn't necessarily changing the outcome of an election in a tangible way towards a particular party. For me, the bigger threat is the wider, more insidious impact on the perceived legitimacy of those elections and the trust which people have in the outcome of those elections. To me, that is a bigger threat than focusing on, say, regime change or covertly sponsoring a change in the outcome, because the threat, I think, is it's chronic. I think it's disruptive. I think it's subversive, and it also feeds on our own internal divisions. The foreign interference is not really separate from internal activity. Hostile foreign states feed and exploit our internal divisions, our weaknesses. They don't create these divisions. They spot them, they exploit them, they polarize, and they try and crack them open as far as possible. So I think that the threat is this general erosion of trust, sowing confusion, undermining our trust in our democratic institutions, and exploiting our own internal weaknesses and turning them against us.
How have these threats to UK democracy evolved since the 2019 election, do you think?
I think in some ways, hopefully we're seeing an improvement. Hopefully, on the one hand, there is, we like to think, less populism and toxicity around now compared to 2019. I think, secondly, we also have more legislation in place. That is an important part, but only, and we'll come on to this later, I assume, only one part of the defence against this type of thing. I think that on the other hand, we see the rise of AI, which you're going to talk about later, the rise of of deep fakes on a mass scale that we didn't see in 2019. And I also think it would be naive to assume that the populism and post-truth politics are behind us. Hopefully we're making steps in the right direction, but we all know how general election campaigns can be. And I also think on a final note, there are potentially more actors willing to try to influence these elections than before, based on open material. I mean, we all know the major players, but we see from the United States, for example, it's actually quite a long list targeting the US. Obviously, we're not the same by any stretch of the imagination, but there could be more actors involved.
And I believe Ms. San Martin wanted to come in, and then I'll come to you, Lord Robertson. Please continue.
Thank you very much. And let me start. I completely agree with Professor Cormac, and I think that when we think of threats to electoral or democratic processes in the digital age, our first impulse is to focus on social media, AI-generated threats, such as the high speed and high volume in which disinformation can spread, manipulated media, malicious manipulated media, coordinated campaigns aimed at disrupting democratic processes. And these threats are there, no doubt. And they create enormous challenges to electoral processes around the world, and the UK is not an exception. And these will probably evolve at a very, very fast pace. But I think I agree with Professor Cormac in which we have to take a step back and see other risks and challenges that are very relevant. One of them is, as he said, trust in democratic processes. The second, I believe, is the broader issues of questioning and challenges to democracy and democratic ideals worldwide. On trust, I think it is important to acknowledge that trust is central to elections. It is one of the main elements to preserve in the electoral processes. And it is something that is built over time, but that can never be taken for granted. And rather, everybody that is involved, electoral authorities, governments, political parties, candidates, even social media companies, need to actively safeguard and preserve trust at all times. And this is not only the objective elements surrounding trust, or the objective institutional design, the objective rules, the objective practices, but it also has to do with public perception of trust. That is exactly why disinformation campaigns can affect the integrity of electoral processes so much. And on the second part, more broadly, I think it's important that we recognize that throughout the world, even in countries that have the most consolidated democracies, democracy and the democratic ideals are being put into question. They are being challenged in different ways and forms. And this is a risk that cannot be overseen or understated. It has proven to threaten even the most consolidated democracies. And why is it important to acknowledge this? Because when we seek to protect and defend democracy, it's fundamental that the answers or solutions that are proposed don't undermine in themselves the problem they seek to solve. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that in democracy, ends do not justify the means. The preservation of democracy is an end that has to be aspired to, but it must also be done through democratic means. The protection of democratic freedoms cannot be at the expense of those same freedoms. And the fear of erosion of democracy has taken many countries to go in a different direction than that.
Thank you. Lord Robertson.
Yes, if I could just pick up on something Professor Cormac said. I was very interested in your point about undermining faith and trust in the democratic process, which I think is a very good point. But I want to pick you up on the toxicity and populism that you referred to in 2019. Could you give us an example of that, and how you think whatever that was will not be present in the next general election, which is presumably coming later this year?
Of course. I think that we are in a better position now than we were in 2019.
In what way?
Well, in terms of the suitability of the two main candidates for Prime Minister. I think that we will hopefully see a sense of not engaging in some of this kind of slightly dubious post-truth politics that we saw in the run-up to the 2019 general election. And I think people generally are more aware now of some of the challenges. I think people are more aware of the risks that once we start to lose trust in the system more widely, once we start to generate perceptions that people are lying and not everything's free and fair, it's very, very difficult to get that trust back. And I think we have seen a shift. I mean, we're having discussions now about this, and I think that's a really important thing in terms of raising public awareness about the threats and the risks that we are facing in a way that I don't think we had in 2019 with the Intelligence and Security Committee's Russia report, for example, raising awareness of some of these risks and allowing us to have these debates in an open and honest and constructive manner. And I think that's really, really important, because as soon as we don't have these debates in an open, honest and constructive manner, that can be exploited, it can be manipulated, and we can be kind of encouraged to turn in on ourselves. That's what hostile foreign actors want. They want us chasing each other. They want us chasing ghosts and turning in on ourselves. And I think that's the risk.
Thank you. I have Mr. Stewart down to ask the next. There you are.
Hello, Professor, and good afternoon to both of you. Thanks for coming. Get your point about the biggest threat being the macro point, the erosion of in the process, erosion of trust in the process. My questions really are about how. How do you do it? Do you AI? You've mentioned supporting toxic groups, maybe, if you can use the word toxic, if it's acceptable. Smear campaigns, money being sent to people, disinformation. How do they do it? How do they do it? I mean, give them some idea, but...
All of the above. I think there are three ways to interfere in an election and to influence an election and to try to undermine trust. The first way is through information operations, disinformation, amplifying misinformation, all this sort of thing. Can do it on a mass scale and generate confusion, exploit some of these divisions, but it's very, very difficult to measure the impact of influence operations on a mass scale. Because as I said earlier, foreign states don't create some of this stuff, they amplify it. So that's way number one. Way number two to influence an election is around political influence activity in terms of exploiting loopholes in electoral funding laws, for example. And hopefully some of that has been cleared up with the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. Again, slightly more targeted or focused than, say, information operations, but difficult to measure impact as well. The third way of doing it is what we call foreign interference, which involves meddling more directly with voter mechanisms, whether that's cyber attacks on electoral registration databases or hacking polling booths. Now, fortunately, here in the UK, obviously, it's more difficult to hack pencils and paper systems, and that is a good thing for foreign interference in that way. So there's the three kind of broad ways of doing it. Most scholars agree that the third way, the direct way, is the most difficult to do, but if you can do it, it has the most tangible and measurable effects.
Thanks very much. Could I ask Ms. San Martin, fundamentally, where the heck do these threats come from? I mean, Russia, Iran, China, obvious. But where do they come from? Who has such an interest in our democracy that they're prepared to put a lot of effort into it?
I think, thank you for the question. I think that a coordinated action that seeks to disrupt democratic processes or to create an atmosphere of distrust to electoral processes, to democracies in themselves, can come from different places. It can come from within a country, and it can come from abroad. It creates enormous risks, threats, challenges for the preservation of democracy, and it has to be addressed. It cannot always be identified exactly where the threats are coming from, but the actions that they support, the impacts that they have, can be addressed throughout electoral processes. In the oversight board that I'm part of, we are convinced that social media companies must do their part on this. Many of the problems that we're living now are not new, and companies have to learn lessons from past experience and have to take responsible steps to address this. That is why, for example, in the Oversight Board, after almost 2 years to the day of the storming of the US Capitol, Meta and other social media platforms were again abused by coordinated campaigns that ended up in an attack to federal buildings in Brazil. Seeing that and seeing that the lessons were not learned from past experiences, we pushed Meta to develop and publish election integrity metrics, which should show us the steps that the company has taken and whether its efforts are working or not. And in November, the company announced that how it would handle major elections. And between the efforts that it was going, or the focuses it would have, it was fighting misinformation and preventing electoral interference. We would expect that these issues be part of those election integrity metrics. And the company also has been recommended that they should carry out due diligence in reviewing its design and policy choices. For example, its newsfeed, its recommendation algorithms, other design features that can amplify this harmful disinformation and enable the platforms to be abused. But if I must say something, I'm going to build on what Professor Cormac said. It is also important that protecting democracy and election integrity is not only a one-way street. Addressing these challenges cannot be limited to identifying and countering the actions of malicious actors. We also have to acknowledge that those actors exploit pre-existing societal democratic fissures, and that they too need to be addressed through democratic means in order to not give space for those malicious actors that are seeking to intervene or interfere in electoral processes. And exactly one of the examples is closing loopholes in campaign finance regulations that allow them to intervene. But it also has to do with investment in media literacy, to strengthening fact-checking networks, to working with platforms to guarantee that they enforce their rules adequately and that they can also provide reliable information on issues that could seed mistrust.
Thank you very much. I should have actually remembered internal attacks too, so you're very right to correct me on that. But I'm just going to ask Professor Cormac to answer, as this is about foreign interference, what foreign origins of interference would you be prepared to name publicly?
Well, with the caveat, of course, I'm not privy to any classified or sensitive information. We've heard extensively from the Intelligence and Security Committee that Russia is likely to try to influence the election. And then one assumes if we take the recent American intelligence assessment report on its 2024 election, it's named China, it's named Iran. Now, obviously, they will have a different relationship to us than they do with America, but clearly they are countries which should be, at the very least, on our radar.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm on the ISC, so I confirm that. Thank you.
Atherton, I think you wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Professor, you'll probably know this. Last December, the National Cyber Security Centre, and this is on open source information, intercepted Star Blizzard, an organisation associated with Russia's Federal Security Service, who launched a campaign, a cyber attack on high target individuals, which is basically everyone in this room. How can we protect ourselves?
I think on an individual level, I think the NCSC has done a good job of trying to build awareness and kind of robustness of our personal and business level ability to spot warning signs, phishing attacks, and all that kind of thing. There's a lot of public awareness and training, and again, it's media literacy. It's not, in this sense, it's not traditional media. It's how we engage with sources from emails or whatever sites it may be. But I think we can't just put the onus too much onto individuals because this is a collective, whole of society response is needed. And I think there are lots of different things we can do. For example, on one level, I'd be very much in favour of the kind of disruptive, intelligence-led offensive cyber efforts where they are proportionate and properly overseen to try to disrupt hostile state activity when it's in terms of cyber attacks or in terms of trying to get to the root of disinformation efforts through bot farms or troll farms or whatever. I think there's a role for intelligence-led disruption alongside the individual literacy, alongside some of the legislation that we've seen over the last year or so. And it's that combination of factors. We're not going to get out of this by devolving all responsibility to individuals. We're not going to legislate our way out of this. So it takes, and we're not going to cyber our way out of this. So it takes a collective response from all these different pillars working together, and it's going to be a long-term thing. We're in for a long game here, I think.
Thanks, Professor.
Lord Butler, please.
Professor Cormac, you've said more research is needed. What are the main gaps that you see in our knowledge, and how can they be filled?
I think a big gap is around how we judge the impact and success of disinformation and online influence operations. Because quite often the research talks about how many clicks or likes or whatever did a particular tweet generate. Now that is measuring outputs rather than outcomes. It doesn't measure what behavioural change that those likes or tweets led to, and it's forever thus. I mean, back during the Cold War, they measured the impact based on how many newspaper articles they managed to get a particular piece of an article into, but that didn't tell anybody what changed as a consequence. So I think ways of measuring outcomes rather than outputs are very important. Secondly, I think we have an over-reliance on metrics to kind of, again, count the outputs. And I think more research is needed on a more psychological or narrative-based approach to how and why this works, rather than what seems like an easier option of metrics. And then thirdly, I think we need more research on how we reach intended audiences when we are countering this type of activity. It seems to me that we focus a lot on fact-checking and exposing, which is a good thing, and we should be fact-checking and exposing. But it is not a silver bullet, because so many of those target audiences who are most receptive to some of this material will see the fact-checking and will ignore it. They'll see it either as sponsor or with the authorship of a government, and they'll think, I don't trust that government. Or they'll see it with the authorship of Meta or Facebook and think, oh, they're all in line with the deep state trying to promote a particular agenda. So I think we need to think very carefully about how, when, and why we expose and fact-check, rather than seeing it as the end goal in itself. And secondly, we need more research on more creative ways of reaching certain target audiences to be as credible as possible, and to encourage that behaviour change that I outlined earlier.
Thank you. Professor San Martin, have you got anything to add?
I completely agree. And what has proven to be more useful is when, in different elections in other countries, has been when the authorities are able to communicate more directly with people. If they are able to find a way to counter disinformation through more adequate means. Usually when you have a disinformation message, it's quick, it's catchy, and anybody can read it. And when you have a fact-checking or a counter message, it is something that is very robust, that is very carefully crafted, and that is very precise. But it does not have the same impact as the disinformation message itself has. And that is something that also needs to be seen and looked into when thinking of these measures. But also the impact that media literacy can have on fighting disinformation, because counter disinformation mechanisms will never be as fast as disinformation spreading or as coordinated campaigns aimed at disrupting democratic processes. So if people can, from the outset, be able to understand or to identify if what they are reading is likely to be some manipulated message, it is something that will get a longer way to achieving its objective. I think that the exercise that has been done in Finland, for example, is very interesting to look into.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Lady Ford.
Thank you very much. Much has been made already of this being a year of elections. Something like 70, I think. We've already had a few, not a very democratic one just this weekend. Do we think that that is going to encourage more foreign interference this year of elections? Start with you, Professor Cormac.
Yes, I do, simply by virtue of the fact there are more opportunities to engage in this kind of thing, more countries, more targets, so I think we will see an increase in the number of attempts. Now, of course, countries lack the capacity to interfere in too many elections at the same time, so what I would imagine would happen would be a kind of maybe copycat type things, learning from each other, but trying to, again, not necessarily change the outcome of individual elections, but taking the whole thing together, trying to just undermine trust in democracy more widely, across all 70 odd elections. That's what I'd be looking out for.
Thank you very much. Pamela, Sir Martin, to you, and I wanted to add to my question to you, there is some possibility that the USA and the UK could be having elections within a week of each other. So in particular in relation to that, do you see heightened threat? Thank you.
I don't think that there's a predetermined answer to this question. In my experience, it can literally go both ways. The sheer number of electoral processes, or having two very important electoral processes occurring at the same time, can have two different effects. It can either hinder the actions of those who seek to undermine democratic processes, or it can become an umbrella that impedes more detailed monitoring of the different electoral processes by social media platforms, by the international community, to raise awareness with regards to what is happening in different democratic processes. But also, something having more than close to 80 elections occurring this year, something that needs to be taken into account is that the first electoral processes that are held, especially in more democratic countries, can serve as a learning experience for the ones that will occur later. A learning experience both to attack electoral integrity, but also to protect democracy. These examples can either strengthen democratic ideals and strengthen trust in democracies and democratic processes, or they can be a disruptive element that affects credibility of democratic processes. All these elections occurring at the same time have unknown outcomes to this moment, but I think that we should plan to the fact that they could be disruptive outcomes.
And can I add a question which is around, in this particular election, we have the background of war in the Middle East, war in Ukraine, where the difference of who wins could massively impact or potentially impact how those go afterwards. For example, it's alleged that President Trump could consider taking funding away from Ukraine. Do you think that adds to the likelihood that we could see quite a lot of foreign interference, especially maybe from Russia in the election? Professor Cormac, any views on that?
Yes, I do. I think any of these contentious issues will invite foreign interference to try either to kind of interfere in a way that suits that particular party's foreign policy, or equally likely interfere just to carry on sowing those divisions and sowing that polarization and trying to make life as difficult as possible for those defending against it and those trying to ensure a free and fair election. I think that with those examples, we'll see an interplay between the foreign influence operations and more internal domestic actors, where it's very difficult to draw a fine line. I mean, there are people domestically, wittingly or unwittingly, amplifying foreign policy lines being fed by certain states who might not have that country's best interests at heart. So again, I think it's quite important to try to break down some of that foreign and domestic division and look at how the two work together, particularly when countering disinformation. If a country has a mandate to counter foreign disinformation, but doesn't have a mandate to counter domestic disinformation because of free speech issues, then how we grapple with the interplay between the two, I think is really important. And the Middle East is highlighting that right now.
Lady Crawley, I think you wanted to come in briefly.
Yes, very, very briefly. We've just had an election in Portugal, and I wondered if either of you had monitored that in any way, had looked at it as far as foreign interference is concerned or disinformation.
I personally haven't, no.
Looks as if neither of you have. Okay.
No, sorry.
Thank you very much. Lord Snape.
Your assessment, Professor Cormac, of the National Security Act 2023, does it actually address the evolving state threats to UK democracy? Perhaps I could add a supplementary at the same time. There's been some criticism of the Act that it's too narrow, that concentrating purely on national security means that other aspects of Britain's democracy could be at threat.
I think that's fair. I think what it does, I think it's a good thing. What it does is give extra tools to counter or disrupt the sharp end of foreign interference when we're making it hopefully easier to catch, I don't know, false declarations of money, for example, or people operating directly on behalf of a foreign state. So the sharp direct end, I think it gives us more tools. What it doesn't do is look at that greyer, more insidious area where arguably a bigger threat comes from, where the agent isn't operating, isn't directed by a foreign power. What about people, I'm talking about the foreign influence registration scheme here, what about people who are operating in the interests of, but not directed by a foreign power? What about the use of opaque shell companies to channel some of this material into? So I think in that sense it's narrow. For me, but that's not to say what it is doing is not a good thing, but there are, I think, lots of loopholes that can be exploited and misses this grey area, because what hostile foreign states have traditionally done is exploit that grey area between legitimate and illegitimate to exploit the various loopholes, and I fear that this could happen here as well, because the Act, for me, takes an assumption that democratic resilience is generally healthy in the UK, and what the security side of things is doing is making life difficult at the sharp end. Whereas, as we've alluded to already, there are other issues which can be exploited maybe below the level of national security, which I don't think the Act necessarily covers. Not that it should. I think you can't legislate for all of this stuff, which is why I would go back to the initial point about resolving some of our internal issues and focusing on media literacy amongst everybody, but from young people all the way through. I mean, this we can't legislate our way out of this. But as legislation goes, it is a step forward, and it's given us tools that we haven't had in the past.
Lord Stansgate, please.
Thank you. You've just said, and in fact repeated twice now, you can't legislate your way out of it. Nevertheless, we have a National Security Act 2023. And can I ask you about one aspect of that, which is the foreign influence registration claim, to which you've made a brief allusion already. How is it intended, in your view, to strengthen the resilience of the UK? And then I've got a follow-up question in the light of it.
I think it is intended to strengthen the resilience of the UK by making life more difficult for hostile foreign actors. I think it will disrupt. I think it will. It gives us a neat piece of legislation to prosecute where appropriate, and it does so without having to air what might be classified material and open that whole can of worms around how we deal with covert influence cases. So I think it will disrupt. It will make life more difficult for those wishing to do us harm.
Okay. Now you mentioned covert influence. What about covert money? How far do you think the Act of 2023 addresses the challenge of the possibility of foreign money being used to influence elections?
Again, I think it deals with the really sharp end. It gives a way to catch false declarations, but I don't think it goes far enough in the broader sense. I mean, you will know there were various discussions in the run-up to the Act, and there are clearly, as I see it, loopholes which can be exploited by hostile foreign powers around companies, around unincorporated associations, where there is potential to bypass the Act. And I think it comes back to a point I mentioned earlier, which is the Act seems to be based on the assumption that we don't have all of these loopholes and grey areas. And so what we needed was a Security Act which would catch at the sharp end, but that still has all of this wider political grey area which can be exploited. And I think it could have gone further.
And one brief follow-up, which is that the Act doesn't make any distinction between foreign and friendly countries. How much of a potential problem is that?
I can see where the Act was coming from on this, because there's always a risk in having lists of friendly countries and unfriendly countries. I can see why that would become quite problematic quite quickly. So I think on balance it was a sensible approach. But there is a risk of increasing burden and red tape on everybody else in order to satisfy the requirements of an Act which genuinely hostile actors may find loopholes for anyway, and then, as is often kind of unintended consequences, legislation increases the burden on everyone else trying to deal with it. And I can see how they've tried to get around that with the two-tier approach. But yeah, I think that is increased administrative burden, I think, is a risk, and I'll be watching very closely to see how that plays out on the ground.
Thank you. Yep.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you. Just to round out the point, Professor Cormac, on financing. At the moment, it's perfectly possible for a significant amount of money that has been earned in a foreign country to come into the bank account of a UK citizen and for it then to go straight into the coffers of a political party. Surely that is one of the biggest loopholes that we should be trying to fix.
I agree. Yes. It is. There are numerous loopholes that can be exploited. That is a very good example, and I think we should be doing more. Now, the question for me is whether that becomes a national security issue, or whether it becomes a domestic politics, standards in public life, whatever it may be. And I think that really gets to point of how we need a whole of government, whole of society approach of dealing with this. And I think there's a risk when we siphon some of this stuff off into different sectors that it can risk being overlooked.
Thank you. So it may have made more sense for us to legislate so that only money that has been earned in the UK can go into a British political party, for example.
Yeah, I think that's
thank you. Pamela, if I can turn to you. You've said a couple of times that the role of social media companies is, in your words, to safeguard trust. And you said earlier that social media companies need to do their part in supporting the democratic process. Can you just lay out a little bit more simply for us what you see as social media companies' responsibilities when it comes to safeguarding democratic integrity in elections?
Of course. Sorry, I thought I was off. Social media companies have the responsibility of enforcing their own policies, their own values in a fair and a transparent way in which users are treated equally. And the positive sides of social media platforms, that is enabling people to access information, enabling people to participate in electoral processes, are safeguarded, but at the same time, the risks of the platforms being misused to undermine democratic processes, to exclude certain voices, to enable certain criminal actors to participate in electoral processes are safeguarded. In for example, regarding Meta, they have tons of how do you call them, risk evaluation and mitigation measures that they have in place and that they can apply to elections. And for them to actually complete that role that they have to act according to their international human rights responsibilities, they have to put all these tools and all these measures into play during elections.
Okay, so sorry to interrupt. In a world where, as we've heard from Professor Cormac, you've got bad actors basically trying to sow aggression and division on two sides of an argument, would it not be helpful if we had a definition of hate speech in this country so that we could just take out more easily that kind of divisive behaviour, like, for example, the German NetzDG law?
I think that the problem of having government-sponsored definitions that will limit freedom of speech is that they can be overly enforced, and that they will be overly enforced by social media.
Is that what's happened in Germany?
That is what has happened with all the laws that have been approved, that have very strict obligations for social media platforms to remove some content, given the scale, the volume of content that moves through social media platforms. What social media platforms have done is overly removing content as to not comply with state legislature. And it also gives an example to countries that may not be democratic countries, that may have other intentions when regulating speech online, to start overly limiting freedom, overly restricting freedom of expression. And that is something that we have to be aware of, because we have been building the guarantees to ensure freedom of expression for more than 200 years. And we cannot lose sight of those guarantees.
Sorry to interrupt. That's true, and you've talked about the need for transparency as one of the remedies for this. But, for example, I don't think we've got transparency into, for example, Meta's algorithms that promote a particular kind of content to the top of people's feeds, do we?
We do not. That is one of the things that we do not have much transparency on, and that the board has recommended that at least Meta should evaluate, it should go and carry out due diligence to determine how its design algorithms impact how harmful disinformation is amplified in that platform, what it does, what it is doing to address these issues, and for its platforms not to be misused. And that is something that should be expected from all social media platforms. We should be able to know how it is that their design decisions impact conversations, especially during elections.
But we haven't got it yet.
No, we don't.
Should we legislate for it?
I think that legislation around transparency is something that can be very positive. Very.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Graham, you wanted to come in briefly?
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to come in really on the same issue, Pamela San Martin. So, I mean, any of us with social media accounts can spot the large numbers of obvious bots who are there, who are commenting. But in August last year, The Guardian reported Meta had closed 9,000 Facebook and Instagram accounts linked to Chinese spamouflage, i.e. foreign influence campaign. Do you think that there is not enough analysis that goes on already about the number of fake accounts? And building on what Liam Byrne was suggesting, do you think we could actually make it harder for accounts to be opened so that actually those that are opened have gone through some form of certification beforehand? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that there's one thing that we cannot lose sight of. It is not only malicious actors who use social media. People get informed through social media. People communicate through social media. People access information that is very relevant to democratic processes through social media. People organize legitimately, politically through social media. If you start putting these sorts of measures into play, it will not be the malicious actors who will be impacted. They will find loopholes to go around that, but you will impact legitimate speech that needs to be preserved online. For example, anonymity in social media platforms is one of the core elements in the infrastructure of social media that enables it to be a platform where people can actually communicate. Safeguards do have to be put in place to avoid the misuse of platforms. Trends, coordinated campaigns have to be part of those measures, of those safeguards that are put into place. And that is something that we in the board expect to be part of, for example, Meta's election integrity efforts. I don't think it's through putting more bigger blocks into opening social media accounts.
So I understand the argument about the balance, the need for democratic intercourse and so on, but nonetheless, a small cyber company in my constituency was employed by Meta and Google during the recent Indian elections and were taking down literally, they told me, millions of Facebook posts every day. Do you think we've got the balance right?
I believe that we have to insist on policies being enforced adequately, to be enforced according to the policies that are being put into place, and that they're enforced equitably. The users are treated fairly in the enforcement of the policy, the social media platforms policies. Are we there right now? No. Will we ever have the exact precise balance? No. Given the sheer number and volume, there will always be mistakes. But what we have to push social media platforms to is that those mistakes are less common, that they don't impact elections and that they don't impact political speech that is so relevant to democracies throughout the world.
If I may, Madam Chairman, can I ask Professor Rory Cormac, I mean, what are your thoughts on this issue? I mean, if millions of Facebook posts have to be taken down during an election in India, are we going to be facing the same thing in America and possibly here? And isn't there something wrong with a system where that volume of fake news has to be monitored and probably inevitably quite a lot gets through?
Yes, I think...
to be succinct because we should be moving on to another panel. But carry on.
Sorry.
I think that the social media companies could and should be doing a lot more to be taking this stuff down quickly, to be sharing their material with non-state actors, with academia, with governments. But I do worry that an overly legislative approach to this would, again, just create the loopholes which the genuinely hostile states would exploit, and everyone else would be encumbered by. And then just very, very finally, I think when it comes to the disinformation, governments shouldn't be arbiters of what is true and what isn't, because it's very rarely a big line, a clear line. So I think that it's good to have things like Meta's Oversight Board taking an independent approach to this, because as soon as governments get involved, it becomes politicized, and people instantly start to accuse governments of being partisan, towing a particular line, which can end up doing more harm than good.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, both of you, very much for coming and giving evidence to the committee. We appreciate it. We have another panel waiting, so if you would be kind enough, we'll try and do this as smoothly and speedily as possible. And hopefully it won't inconvenience you too much if we move on fairly speedily to the questions. Mr. Clark, I believe you're first.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for coming. Can I start by asking Mr. Wolfe to give us his perspective on the danger, the threats to our democracy, and particularly the UK elections, of technologies, in particular AI?
It's a fairly scary question to start off with. How many hours do you have? So this is one of the areas on which I feel least confident, in the sense I understand, I think, some of the issues involved in what's going on now, but I'm looking forward to hearing the other witnesses on what this means. But it seems to me that so let's get to first principles. Democracy is fundamentally based on public discussion and debate, and the possession of reliable information and information that people trust is reliable, and on the basis of which they can discuss with confidence with one another, are pretty close to necessary conditions for democracy to run. And I've been thinking about how democracy evolved, and it's pretty clear that the emergence of the press played a pretty important part of that. Now, I wouldn't say that all parts of the press have achieved that to an equal degree at all times, but they were all very clearly, it was transparent who was doing it, what they were saying. And of course, in the 20th century, public service broadcasting played a pretty big part in our democracy. So if, to conclude, we are in an environment in which there is a risk of widespread and sophisticated fakes, and in which many people believe because they look very plausible, in which tainted information of all kinds is spread, the consequences of which is more likely to be simply pervasive distrust than that everybody will trust any particular one of this, I think that will make, it's bound to make, or is at least highly likely to make, the functioning of a democracy substantially more difficult and democratic institutions less stable.
Thank you. I mean, you're a journalist of great distinction, a columnist of influence. How does it feel for you in this, an important election year in this country? You contribute analysis to help people make these decisions. Does it feel more difficult for you to have the influence that you've had in previous years in this year as a result of some of the development of these technologies?
Well, I have two answers to that, which are probably not very satisfactory. The first is I try very, very, very hard never to think, and I'm 100% successful, I think, about the influence I might have in anything that I write. I always start off from the assumption that it's zero, which is probably a good bet, partly because one doesn't know at all, and secondly because it's grotesquely self-important. So I really don't know whether this affects anything. The second point is I'm privileged, I think, given that I write about economics and finance, to be writing for the organ I write about. It's a pretty small readership. I tend to think this readership has two important characteristics. It's very well informed, and it is paying rather a lot of money to read the Financial Times because it thinks it's getting a certain sort of value. So I don't think that with our readers, the environment more broadly is particularly important, affected. You just have to think who they are. Most of them are people involved in business and finance or things close to that. And for them, the reliability of information is more or less sort of almost life and death. I mean, they have to have something they trust. And I would say that's why they read the FT. I'm not saying we're the only ones, but that's why they read it. But this is not necessarily true of everybody in the marketplace, and our readership is pretty tiny compared to that of the electorate as a whole.
Thank you. And just finally to Ms. Zucker, you're the Online Safety Policy Director for Ofcom, in other words, the communications regulator. You have responsibilities for regulation as well as the education of the public, if I can call it that way. What is the liable to be the most influential area? Is it to educate the public to spot disinformation and manipulation, or do you feel that the path of regulation can offer some dependable protections?
Well, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet solution here, which is why we're taking sort of a multifaceted approach to how we're looking at these threats. So as you know, the Online Safety Act empowers Ofcom to hold platforms to account for the first time to ensure that they put in process systems that really effectively prevent the spread of illegal harm. So in this case, that constitutes foreign interference. There's a number of ways in which we'll be able to hold these platforms to account to ensure that they actually do something about this. Some of the ways that we suggest that platforms do this, we've set out in our set of proposals for illegal harms, which we published at the end of last year. This includes things like having sufficiently staffed content moderation teams, having really robust governance processes to make sure that seniors at organizations are aware of the risks. We're asking platforms to do risk assessments to look at the risk of foreign interference on their platforms and take appropriate measures to address those risks. And for some of the biggest platforms that we call categorized services, so a subset of the 100,000 companies that we'll regulate, they're going to be subject to additional duties. So things like transparency reporting, where we'll be able to ask them to publish information about these kinds of risks and what they're doing to address them. We'll also be putting in place something called the Terms of Service duty, which means for some of the biggest platforms, many of them have policies around foreign interference, inauthentic behavior, mis and disinformation, and we'll be empowered as regulator to hold them to account to enforce those rules if they say that they have them. Media literacy, of course, is another area that we're investing quite a lot in. We've had considerable powers for the last several years. Some of the ways that we're thinking about media literacy is to help users on these online services be able to find and identify misinformation when they come across it. So we've been running campaigns. We're partnering with external organizations to do just that.
Thank you. You speak mostly in the future tense. The Online Safety Act is now law. Do you feel that Ofcom has put in place for this important electoral year the necessary protections that the law requires and empowers you to put in place?
The Online Safety Act received royal assent at the very end of last year, and as soon as that happened, we published our first set of proposals on illegal harms. Parliament asked us to prioritize the most severe harms first, so we started with first phase of our regulation, which is on preventing the spread of illegal content, so foreign interference, one of them, but also things like child sexual abuse material, grooming, fraud, violent hate speech. The second part of our regulatory implementation, which Parliament asked us to prioritize, is protecting children against potentially harmful content. And then the last phase will be the additional set of duties that the biggest and highest reach services will have to put in place. So we're taking a phased approach. The way that Ofcom approaches regulation is through an evidence-based process. So we take our time to ensure that we have a certain threshold of evidence that we then can turn into impact assessments and then propose measures that platforms take. So where we are in the process now, we've published our first set of proposals at the end of last year. We've just closed our consultation about a month ago. We're reviewing that information and we'll update our codes of practice and our guidance documents likely by the end of this year.
By the end of the year? Too late for the election?
Potentially. We don't know when the election is, but we're in the process now of assessing the data that we got from this consultation period. We do have to do a consultation, and that's the first step of this regulatory process.
As the Prime Minister has helpfully indicated that the election will be in the second half of this year, can you act on that and bring forward your steps so that they're in place in time for the election?
Well, we are moving as quickly as possible. As soon as the bill received royal assent, we published our first set of proposals right out the gate. It is a process that requires us to look at evidence. We think that proportionality is really important. And because we are requiring services to do things that is quite novel, really, we have to make sure that we're following a set of processes to make sure that we're holding them to the highest standards and that we have an evidence to go back to.
Thank you,
Well, continuing on the theme of UK politics, we've already seen some notorious deepfake videos and radio videos involving for example, President Macron, Joe Biden, Imran Khan, Sadiq Khan back here in Britain, even Keir Starmer. How confident are you, if I may address this to Jessica Zucker, that Ofcom will be able to detect these fake videos and audios which may appear in the lead up to our general election and put a stop to them?
Absolutely. One of the good things about the Online Safety Act is that it's tech neutral, which means that it can withstand the test of time. So if somebody creates a deepfake video, for example, using the new kinds of generative AI content and posts it on one of the services that we regulate, which is either search service or user-to-user service, that content is regulated by the Online Safety Act. And as I mentioned before, that empowers Ofcom to then hold the platforms to account when it comes to either the spread of illegal content. So I mentioned a couple. You mentioned certain types of deepfake videos. So some of the kinds of risks that we've seen that we're anticipating are things like deepfakes with non-consensual sharing of sexual imagery, pornographic material, or material that harasses. These are the type of things that will be covered by the Online Safety Act. But I should also say that there are other less sophisticated forms of disinformation that we've seen in the last few years that remain a persistent threat. So these are so-called cheap fakes or less sophisticated types of disinformation where there's sort of light editing. So it might be splicing or cropping a video or changing an image in a way that might mislead. And these are things that we're also seeing. They present challenges for the platforms.
But is it a challenge you're going to be able to meet before the date of the general election?
As I mentioned before, our powers we anticipate coming into full force at the end of this year once we've finalized our legal harms consultation. That said, we do have our powers on media literacy, which we're actively using. One of the ways that we're planning to do so is running a campaign that targets new voters, so aged 18 to 24, to help them spot disinformation and identify them different types of critical thinking skills that might be needed in order to spot that.
Yeah, it's not your fault. It seems to me that we're a bit late on the game in this respect. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I believe, Dr. Aitkin, that you're going to show the committee a relevant image.
Yeah, so I have an image here. It's an AI-generated image. This is an image of the aftermath of an earthquake and tsunami. It's the Cascadia earthquake in Oregon in 2001, which you would probably wouldn't have heard of, except you may have heard of it last year, because these photos were created in 2023 using Midjourney, and they were shared on our Reddit group, sharing AI-generated content. What it shows is a fairly convincing image of the aftermath of a natural disaster. And many AI-generated images like these are being shared online of politically relevant or sensitive events, as well as natural disasters such as this. Now, when you first look at it, it's fairly convincing, but there are some telltale signs when you look more closely, and we have the advantage of seeing it quite large here. Firstly, if you look at the text on the sign that's on the bottom left of the screen, from a distance, it looks like it's probably got words, it's text, but if you look close up, you see that the letters are not identifiable, distinguishable letters. It's kind of garbled text. This is a common sign within AI-generated images. Even the most sophisticated AI image generators struggle with producing legible, coherent text. So that's one sign to look for. Another sign within this image is, so there's some details, for example, the traffic lights. Again, if we were to expand on the traffic lights, you'd see that they are a bit fuzzy around the edges. They're not fully formed. And these are things you probably wouldn't notice if it was a small image that you're looking at on your phone or been shared on social media, but when we can look at it large, we can see those details. Again, looking at the police tape that runs along the side, if you look at the far left of the image, you can see it it fades away. And it looks perfectly tight, as though it must be secured very tightly, but actually we can see that it fades off into the distance. These are some of the sorts of details of signs to look for. There are other things that you might look for in a potentially AI-generated image, such as looking at shadows, if the shadows fall in the right place. Looking at the background of an image, so often the foreground might be quite detailed, might be quite crisp and clear, whereas the background may be a bit more impressionistic or less detailed. Taking it further, you can look at things like if this is an image reporting an event on a particular day in a particular place, you can check the weather conditions, see if they are as they should be. If there were people in the image, there are things like looking at, a fairly well-known one now is counting the number of fingers. AI image generators have a long history of struggling with fingers. Also, number of teeth in a mouth. And then details like the texture of the hair or the texture of the skin can be giveaway signs. But it's important to note that these technologies are getting more sophisticated all the time. They're becoming more and more convincing all the time. And so that while there are still things that we can look for and signs that we can look for, it's becoming harder. It's becoming much more difficult to reliably or accurately, consistently identify AI-generated outputs. And I'd also say that these are images that we have we see this on a large screen, but for the most part these are images that are shared, probably low resolution, shared on social media. People are mostly scrolling past images on a small screen on a phone. And I think that it's important to emphasise that the responsibility here shouldn't be on individual users or individual members of the public to be scrutinising all images or all online content, but instead we need to think much more carefully about the responsibilities of platforms on which these images or potentially AI-generated content is shared, and how we can ensure transparency around the ways that AI-generated content might be being created and shared. So yeah, these are some kind of tips or things to look for in AI-generated images, but I do think it's important to emphasise that this shouldn't all be about putting the responsibility or the expectation on members of the public to scrutinise all content.
Chair, if I may just ask finally one supplementary. So again to Ofcom, will you have an expert panel who are watching this sort of thing, or will you be relying on the platforms to do it?
So the Online Safety Act is not a content takedown regime, so it doesn't mean that people at Ofcom will be looking at individual pieces of content or looking at individual complaints. Instead, what the Online Safety Act is designed to do is to look at online harms at scale by looking at the systems and the processes that platforms have to deal with these kinds of issues. We will be putting together an advisory committee on disinformation, likely towards the end of the year as well. And that committee will consist of experts on disinformation as well as UK-specific disinformation issues. That committee will be tasked with advising Ofcom on our duties that are relevant to mis and disinformation, so including how we use our transparency powers, our media literacy powers, as well as the other sort of relevant duties that I mentioned related to foreign interference and applying terms of service effectively.
Thank you. Lord Brown, please. Oh, sorry, Lord Stansgate.
Well, I've got a couple of... I thought we had general questions about this.
Yes.
How quickly did you realise it was a fake?
Well, I have to confess that in this instance, this was an example that's shared on a Reddit page, where people were sharing AI-generated images. So it was at the point, this was an image which I knew was fake when I came to it. Okay. I do think that gives, knowing that it is fake, obviously then you have you scrutinise these images more.
Right. If you take another example that you haven't seen before, and you realise it's a fake, how quickly can you act to take it down?
Well, I mean, this is, against a matter of ensuring the transparency. That is, this is not necessarily about taking images down, but having the transparency to clarify that these are AI-generated images. It's different if they are AI-generated images that are being spread for malicious purposes, or to cause harm, or to humiliate or incriminate. Then that is clearly there's a case for taking those images down.
Supposing you had, in the middle of an election, suddenly an image like this appears in Britain of damage or bombing. Some group does claim or doesn't claim responsibility for it. It could cause a great deal of interest and alarm, and you realise that it's fake. How quickly can you take action to tell everybody it's fake?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a real challenge, and at the moment, these images could be flagged, could be reported. When they are politically sensitive, they may be taken down more swiftly. But that is, at the moment, that this is not.
You don't know how quickly you could do it. You mentioned an advisory group that won't be set up towards the end of the year, and as my colleague over here has said, that is going to be too late for the late of an election. We might go through an election period where something like this happens every day, for all we know. Okay, anyway, that's...
May I just clarify one of the answers that Ms. Zucker's just given on that? You mentioned the creation of a disinformation and misinformation advisory committee. That is in fact required under Section 152 of the Act. In October last year, in answer to a question from Lord Clement Jones, the Minister, Lord Camrose, said that it was the role of Ofcom to create it, and he would liaise with it to make sure it's speeded up. The committee hasn't been created yet. The group hasn't been created yet, I take it, from your answer.
No, and that's because Parliament asked us to prioritise the most severe harms first. So they've asked us specifically to prioritise illegal harms, which we've done so, and following that, protecting children against potentially harmful content.
When Lord Camrose, said that he undertook to liaise with Ofcom to ensure that it's speeded up, to make sure that it's speeded up, are you aware of the conversation that the Minister had with your organisation?
It's possible that that's happened. I don't recall directly, but I can tell you that we are prioritising this alongside the rest of our statutory duties. Unlike the duties that we have around illegal harms and protection of children, we have statutory deadlines that we need to make. We do plan on setting this up as quickly as possible. It does take time to find the right people to ensure we run a sort of open and fair process, and we are doing that. But like I said, we're not ignoring the fact that this is an issue. We have media literacy powers in place, and we're thinking about a number of ways that we can start bringing information out into the public through commissioning research, publishing discussion papers, running media literacy campaigns that highlight the risk of disinformation.
Nearly 6 months ago, the Minister told Parliament that he would make sure that it is speeded up. Has it been?
Well, I should also note that the Online Safety Act does not specifically identify mis or disinformation as a harm that platforms need to take into account when they're putting these protections in place. So the primary way that the disinformation risks are addressed through the Online Safety Act is through the terms of service duty that I mentioned before, through the transparency reporting, as well as a number of the other provisions around foreign interference. And that's really where we're focusing our efforts.
Notwithstanding what the Minister says?
Excuse me?
Despite what the Minister says?
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Lord Brown, please.
The questions I was intending to ask, I think I've already been engaged with, but I'm not entirely sure that they've been answered. But I suspect that our witnesses don't think there, are easy answers to any of them. I mean, this new technology and these fakes, are moving at a pace that's very difficult to keep up with. And I think you, Dr. Aitkin, yourself, I think it was you that said it, they're getting better all the time. Essentially, how confident can we be, or how confident is Ofcom, for example, that broadcasters will be able to detect and stop the publication of these if they improve much more than that one was? There wasn't that much mistake in it, really, to be honest. It seems to me we're going to get to the point that we're going to be asking even these platforms to have this responsibility primarily, and I understand that this will just be too good. It will fake them too. It can't be that far away.
Which question, or which
one? Well, I guess start with you, Jessica, if I may call you that. We constantly are catching up with this technology. We can't help that, but it's pretty obvious that's what we're going to be doing very shortly.
You're right, the technology is evolving rapidly, and the risks around it and the way that people use these technologies and online services is really evolving rapidly. As I mentioned before, fortunately, the Online Safety Act is technology neutral, which means that it's about the harms that are created rather than the types of technology that are used to address those. There is a lot of research underway that we are doing as Ofcom, but is out there by organizations like the Alan Turing Institute, which puts tools out there for the public, for users, as well as for platforms to use to better detect it. At Ofcom, the kind of research that we are doing to understand the risk and detection of deepfakes include things like inscription. So this is using watermarks or a way of sort of labeling AI-generated content so that it can be later identified as such. We're looking into ways to prevent the malicious use of deepfake technology, such as looking at the kinds of data sets that are used for training generative AI models, as well as kind of novel detection methods that can indicate when something has been AI generated. These are things that Ofcom is looking into and researching, and as we have more information and working with organizations like the Alan Turing Institute, we'll be able to iterate on our codes of practices that set out the proposals that platforms need to put in place to address these kinds of risks.
If I just may, pursue this a bit. It seems that we as a country have decided, or at least we're on the route to, an AI regulation policy which regulates at the point of use, not at the point of development. But if you take deep fakes, for example, 80% of deep fakes are created for misogynistic or revenge porn purposes. 80% of them or more. Does this reality of this technology, should it not cause us to rethink the point at which we regulate it? Some of these technologies should be regulated or banned at the point of development as opposed to the point of use, because they have no positive use. They're designed to fake people. The answer is in what they call them. They're fakes. Every other fake I know about is illegal. It's going to be almost impossible to regulate this if we only regulate it at the point of use.
I think it's a really interesting point, and certainly when we look at the regulatory applications across the AI lifecycle, and there are decisions that are made at all stages, from the kind of early design of AI models through to the development of those models, and then to how those are deployed and used in context. And there are important decisions that are made at all of those stages, so we need to think very carefully about what are the expectations around ethical and responsible practice through all of those stages. In the case of generative AI, these are largely developed as a general purpose AI models, so models that are designed to be used not for a particular purpose or for a particular function, but be able to be further developed or deployed in different contexts and for a variety of purposes. And that does raise particular challenges to the extent to which the potential harms or the risks are fully anticipated in design and development of models, which might be deployed for uses or in contexts that were not fully anticipated in those earlier stages. It certainly does present particular risks, and I think that we should be exploring how we ensure that there are responsible and ethical approaches throughout that whole life cycle, and not just at the point where those technologies are deployed and are being used. Currently at the moment in the UK, the regulatory approach to AI is looking at how the uses of AI fit within the remits of existing regulators in the wide variety of contexts and purposes for which they're being used. And that reflects the fact that AI is being used across a wide range of sectors, across all industries. And so currently, regulatory bodies across all sectors are needing to grapple with the challenges of regulating uses of AI. And I think that does point to the need to make sure that there is access to state-of-the-art expertise around AI to be able to not just react to what's currently happening or what we're currently seeing, but to also anticipate how these technologies might develop and how they might be used in a year or in 2 years, to be able to anticipate and not just react. I think that really does point to the importance of having access to state-of-the-art expertise around cutting-edge AI technologies.
Can I ask another quick follow-up? In the middle of an election, an image occurs or a deep fake is produced. Is Ofcom going to be ready for the questions that it will face as to whether or not, or how you can tell something is fake or real? Because major national broadcasters might turn to Ofcom and say, well, you have a role in this, and are you prepared for what may be coming in the middle of what could be a very heated election campaign?
As I mentioned before, the Online Safety Act is not a content takedown regime, so my team is not going to be looking at individual instances of content and making decisions about that. Instead, we're looking at the systems and the processes. I mentioned before, in terms of the timing, that the duties on online services will likely go in effect at the end of the year. That's also to say that platforms can very well get on with implementing the Act, and there's really nothing stopping them from doing that. We have already seen some platforms taking active steps to apply the duties that we've set forth in our draft proposals, and we think that this is a really positive sign. We also do have our media literacy powers, and I mentioned before that we're thinking about a campaign to target young new voters in order to how to spot mis and disinformation. Working with organizations like Dr. Aitkin's Institute would help us kind of empower the public to be able to better spot and identify these types of things.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I begin with you, Mr. Wolf? There's a phrase that I gather is used, the liar's dividend, that there is so much false information circulating that we reach a stage where people find it impossible to recognise what's true and what isn't. How much does that worry you? How likely do you think that is?
Well, it worries me a great deal. I don't know whether we're there yet. I think not. But there is clearly areas in which the degree, in very important areas of decision-making, where the degree of scepticism about what people are being told, partly because of the way they're interacting with others on platforms and the sort of evidence they're given, the degree of skepticism is socially completely horrifying. So one of the most interesting areas, because it's so surprising to me, is the transformation of the level of skepticism about vaccines, which, somebody like me, if I had been asked 25 years ago whether what we've seen in many very sophisticated countries was possible, I would have said it's inconceivable, because every damn fool knows that vaccines work. But that is no longer true. And that's a pretty fundamental medical achievement. One of the great revolutions started here. And there's immense skepticism about it. And this is pretty primitive systems for spreading misinformation. There are obviously possibilities of numerous other fakes generating social panics of various kinds. And of course, we've seen this in the past where popular hysteria is encouraged and you end up with massacres. I mean, this is part of human history. So out of control information and disinformation of this kind can obviously be socially harmful on a catastrophic level. Now, the big question I have, it's part I addressed in my book, and is that it's not new. So I've already mentioned some examples. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, for example. So, and the most important mass disinformation case, I suppose, in European history was in the 30s, which led to the Holocaust. So it's not new. I can't make up my mind whether the technology itself is so transformative that it will become a completely unmanageable problem. But having heard the discussion already, I'm not more optimistic than I was when I came into the room. So I was just thinking about, this is a complete ignoramus, but I was just reading about the possibility of having systems that could convert stories into completely plausible films. I mean, feature film length things. If the technologies in question were also given the information required to replicate pretty well perfectly living individuals, the potential of fakes of this kind could be absolutely extraordinary. And we are clearly at a very, very early stage of new technologies with potentially extraordinarily far-reaching consequences. And given what's already happened in the last few years in the areas I've mentioned, reactions of various kinds on in many ways, then yes, it's very disturbing, and I don't know how easy it will be to regulate it, though I'm very pleased somebody's trying.
Yes, I take your point entirely. All my life, one of the things that's been important to me is to understand that there's a difference between evidence and opinion.
This is no longer so well, there is clearly a difference conceptually. The question is whether we will actually be able to differentiate in this context.
One of the things I've learnt is that already it seems many people can't. Okay. Sorry, I've slightly lost track of where we are. Mr. Byrne.
Thank you very much. Jessica, I'm not quite sure how you can judge the integrity of the processes that you said you're policing without getting involved in examining the content. When we began thinking about the online safety bill, we had in mind the safety at work legislation from the early 1970s, and I think we wouldn't really judge whether health and safety at work processes were working without having one eye on the accident or fatalities that might have been going on in a workplace. Are you seriously telling us that you're not going to be looking at online content when you're making judgments about whether processes are working?
My job is to implement the Act as it's currently in legislative form. The Act does not say that Ofcom should be looking at content and making decisions about that. What we have put out is a set of proposals that explain the specific steps that we think platforms need to take to address a various degree of different harms. Those steps are meant to be quite specific, and for us to be able to look at, for example, whether a platform has a terms of service. That's an example of the kinds of rules that platforms need to put in place that say this is what's allowed and not allowed on the platform.
Do you think you can withstand the pressure of, say, during a general election campaign, people inundating you with examples of content, and your reply is then, I'm really sorry, but we don't look at content, we just check the processes are in order?
Well, unlike the regulations that we have in broadcasting, Ofcom does not have a sort of complaint center that is meant to look at individual pieces of content. and that's really clearly laid out in the Act. Again, my job as Online Safety Regulator is to implement the Online Safety Act.
So there may be a shortcoming in the law.
It's not for me to say. That's a matter for government and Parliament to take up. My job is to implement the Act.
Okay, and so how big is the resource that you've got available to check the safety of these platforms? How much resource have you got to check that the Online Safety Act is being effectively implemented?
So the UK government appointed us Online Safety Regulator in 2020. Since then, we've been staffing up and trying to find the right expertise to make sure that we can do this job. At the end of last year, I believe we had close to 350 people across the organization. This consists of a mix of different expertise. So you have online safety experts with expertise in individual harm areas that are covered by the Act. So we have experts in child sexual abuse, in foreign interference, in grooming, for example. We also have data scientists, economists, we have researchers, lawyers, we have regulatory delivery specialists, and cumulatively we work together to implement this.
Time is just short. Have you got are you satisfied that you now have the capability to implement the Act effectively?
It's not for me to say. We do have a huge team that's working together.
You're not the Director of Online Safety Policy at Ofcom?
That's correct. And we are in the early stages of implementing the Act.
Capability in place.
We're in the early stages of implementing the Act right now. Like I said, we've been focusing on building up the capabilities of the group, on going through each phase of the regulation. And at the end of the implementation phase, the Secretary of State will be required to do a look at the efficacy of the Online Safety Act. That'll think will be a good time for Ofcom to then input into a formal process into how the regulation is working in practice.
We've got to wait and see, in effect.
Well, like I said before, we're early stages of implementation. We're following the direction of Parliament to implement the most severe harms first. We've published our package of proposals on those illegal harms. We're now going through the evidence and we're finalising those proposals, which again will be published at the end of this year.
Now, we've heard that the transparency around algorithms, for example, is going to be really important because we know that platforms like Facebook can promote content that is divisive to people. Do you think that transparency is important in order to effectively police these platforms?
I do think transparency is going to be one of the most powerful tools that we have under the Online Safety Act. What we'll be able to do is require certain types of platforms, those that we consider categorized, which I can explain, will have to publish information that we've asked them to, and then Ofcom will then look at all the platforms' transparency reports and then publish our own analysis of whether we think things are going well, good practice, bad practice.
And the UK government has just now intervened in the debate about the Digital Markets Bill to prohibit foreign state ownership of a UK newspaper because it's worried about a different kind of algorithm called editorialising, and it doesn't want foreign state ownership control of something like a newspaper with a digital platform attached. I think it was inspired to act by the takeover bid for the Daily Telegraph, but obviously TikTok has twice the news share of the Daily Telegraph. If the UK government is acting to legislate to stop state ownership of the Daily Telegraph, should we be following the example of the US House of Representatives and actually legislate to ensure that ByteDance divests itself of TikTok here in the UK?
Again, the matter of what the scope of the laws are is not for Ofcom, that's for government, Parliament to decide. I do think that these are separate issues, though. We're talking about state-owned ownership, which is a slightly different issue considering compared to user safety.
Mr. Wolf, what do you think?
I have no views on ByteDance. I've read a lot about it. In other words, whether TikTok is a threat or not. I do think, this is a more general point, and I've thought a bit about this, that if we want to change the behaviour of companies, so leave aside banning them, then there has to be really severe penalties for disseminating false and dangerous content. In other words, as you'd expect, they should have the responsibilities of publishers, and because that's what they are. And I also happen to believe, since I'm an economist, that incentives change behaviour. And I'm not going to make, it seems to me pretty clear, I've read quite a bit about it in doing my book, that a number of quite important platforms have really not cared very much about the consequences because it's very profitable for them not to do so. And incentives matter. So in future legislation, we should take, I think, some of the lessons we've learned from banking regulation.
Very interesting. Thank you. Lady Ford, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wolf, you talked earlier about you are a well-known and highly respected commentator. The media, the traditional media, has more, in a way, more trust, but less people using it more and more, especially the young. Coming into this election year, is there a role for more trusted newspapers such as the one you work for to play a role in the election, and what sort of role do you think in terms of, I'm thinking of, we had Full Fact come to the BBC, which was new, relatively new from previous elections. Is there something that newspapers can be doing to sort of earn the trust of the electorate?
Well, I suppose our view is elections are part of what we do. We cover them in great detail and depth with the resources we have at our disposal, which are obviously not infinite, and we do so for our subscribers. Now, this is where it gets difficult. One way one could imagine, I'm not going to commit our organisation, is to change paywall rules during an election campaign. Not very likely. But that it's obvious that, I've discussed this before, it's a really interesting point. The economics of information sort of demand that it be free in some sense, because it's a public good. But the economics of businesses generating the information demands that it not be free, because it's a private good. And so we putting vast resources into coverage of the election, which we certainly will have, are no more able than any other organisation to give it away for free. So and that's even true with the BBC, which is paid for, but at the margin it's free. For us, we can't have a model quite like that. But I think every media organisation has to think about how it operates in the context of an event as significant as an election. But basically, it is part of the news, and that's what we do. Finally, crucially, we can't make people read what they don't want to read, and I'm afraid our articles are quite long and detailed and full of facts, and we will never be able to compete with the number of other organs in the number of people who read it. And that's just something we have to accept. That's part of a free society.
Ms. Wolf, you are basically saying that coming into election period, newspapers and their high paywall should be thinking about that in terms of people reading from the same place and having in a sense a truth or reality that they share. And that brings me to a point to Dr. Aitkin, which is on social media, of course, it's the opposite problem. Masses of information all disseminated where we can't necessarily see it and what they're saying to different people. In what sense can we sort of urge or work with the social media companies to see a bit more what they're up to and to get best practice coming into the election?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's really important to recognise that where people are getting their information from and how people are accessing news is changing, and certainly across different demographics or different age groups. Social media, sites like TikTok, Instagram, are increasingly a source of information about the world, particularly for young people, and where people are seeking for information or accessing news about the world. And so it's really important that we pay close attention to how that information is being filtered, how it's being shaped, prioritised, served to different users, and very often being prioritised through algorithms that are creating profiles of individual users to serve it content which is most likely to to keep people engaged on those sites, but not necessarily with an incentive of that being the most accurate information, but rather the information which are going to keep people most engaged. And that's a real problem. And I think we definitely need to demand more transparency, more accountability around the ways that these algorithms are being used and the impacts that they're having on how people access information about the world. There's real risks around that increasing kind of personalisation of information, and especially the way that information is being served through prioritising information that's going to keep people engaged, and a lot of research has pointed to that previously being often the information which is most likely to shock, or the often most polarising information, and leading people to increasingly consume information within kind of echo chambers that reinforce existing worldviews or prejudices or political ideologies, and that's a real concern. I think one of the traditional media, or traditionally it was that people were consuming the same media and were exposed to different points of view and were challenged to encounter different points of views and perspectives. And there's a risk that as information about the world is increasingly consumed in these more isolated, personalised echo chambers, that we don't have the same exposure to alternative perspectives, alternative views, and the opportunity to challenge those views, which is of fundamental importance within a democracy. So I think it is really important that we pay attention to the ways that the information is being consumed across different platforms. And this is an area of real importance.
Mr. Graham, briefly.
Thank you very much. Martin Wolf, can I come back to you as one of, I suspect, of several fans of your column in the FT? In your book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which forgive me for not yet having read, did you tackle
We're
the
in
issue...
good company.
Did you tackle the issue raised by some of the written evidence we received before this session, which was about what the authors called democratic autonomy? Their argument was broadly, the less citizens know about their political options, the less we achieve democratic autonomy. And they went on to suggest that disinformation muddies trust, citing, for example, Russia's information on Hillary Clinton, leading citizens into thinking that she had more character shortfalls than her opponent. Their solution to this, or one of them, was basically to give a dollop more money to the BBC in order to expand what it's doing both domestically and abroad, in order to try and improve the trust of the information that voters are getting. Do you think that's a good solution?
Well, as I said at the very beginning in response to Mr. Clark's question, trust in information and ideally shared trust, I mean, that people would agree, as the chair suggested, on what the facts are, the famous remark of Daniel Patrick Moynihan on that, is essential for any functioning political process. As we've also heard, the algorithms that work for the platforms are very clearly not designed to produce information that deserves to be trusted, though it might by accident deserve to be trusted. What it spreads is what spreads. I mean, it's designed to function like a virus that does what viruses do, and that's to me quite simply terrifying. So that's why I talk about the platform responsibilities. Now, how do you respond to that? There are basically only two ways that I can think of. One is to change the incentives for the platforms, which is very, very complicated. And the other is to strengthen such public service institutions as we have, which may be old-fashioned, and are certainly not going to have the effectiveness they had 40, 50 years ago when they were a monopoly. So I do argue that those countries that are lucky enough to have inherited from the past public service organisations which are reasonably trustworthy, though that's now quite controversial, but I continue that view, like the BBC, should do everything they can to maintain that model. And I think I'm influencing that to a very significant degree by looking pretty carefully at the literature on and the evidence on what's happened to the US in the last 4 decades. And it's not a very pretty picture.
So your answer effectively is yes.
The answer, I apologise, it was a lengthy answer to give a rationale for the answer being yes.
Thank you.
Without thinking that it's in any way a magic cure, because it isn't.
Can I just ask, Chair, Dr. Mhairi, Aitkin, do you think there are other solutions that a country like ours should be looking at to increase the trust of information?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen developments around, so for example, content credentials, in providing more information about the veracity of images. So for example, the BBC recently launched content credentials where they're providing evidence about what they've done to check the veracity of an image and to identify that it's not an AI-generated image, and also to provide information about the source of an image, how it might have been edited, and metadata within content that is shared. There are kind of technical solutions like this that I think we need to that need to be there, an important component of how information and how content is shared through the media. But importantly, that there is public understanding and transparency around these technical tools, so that it's not, as I said before, that the emphasis shouldn't be on expecting members of the public to scrutinise all content, but they should have access to a reliable source of information, a trusted source of information from a reliable, trustworthy body that provides those assurances about that content, and provides a place and tools to verify online content. There's a lot of interest in developing technical tools to detect AI-generated content, AI detection tools, and also use of watermarks to identify AI-generated content. And those could be digital watermarks, which could be not visible to within the kind of the images or the videos, but able to be detected through use of AI detection tools to detect digital watermarks within AI-generated outputs. And obviously this is a really important area where we need much more research to advance these techniques. At the moment, these techniques, AI detection tools often have quite low levels of accuracy, and so we need to be very cautious about how we use them and to what extent we rely on these tools. Systems like digital watermarking can work well where people are in compliance, but if there's a malicious actor that is seeking to deliberately spread disinformation or deliberately create fake content, these are devices which can be circumvented. So I think we need to think very carefully about, there are technical solutions, but there are also important social or political solutions around how we maintain trust within institutions of the media and also political institutions, and that is not purely a technical challenge. That's a challenge around the relationships that members of the public have with the media as well as with political institutions.
Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Regan, just on this subject, I mean, the real power of the algorithm is its ability to be able to, from the data that we create ourselves, understand our patterns of behaviour and anticipate them or reinforce them, right? Which is how they sell things to us and what these people do with the misinformation, right? So, is it not the case, therefore, in that world, that the people who are intent on harm create these same patterns? Is it not possible for algorithms to detect the people who are in there for malicious purposes? Do they not leave a pattern of behaviour that would direct us to where they are operating and therefore would justify us stopping them from operating in the system at all?
This is an area where we have to be really cautious. I mean, as I said, currently AI tools that are designed to detect AI-generated content don't have sufficiently high levels of accuracy to be relied on. Particularly, as examples of within education settings, there's been a lot of interest in developing AI detection tools to detect potentially AI-generated courseworks, and these have been found consistently to be to have low levels of accuracy, but importantly to disproportionately have false positives for students for whom English is not their first language. And this is an example of where using these tools or relying on detection tools might have inadvertently create inequitable outcomes or lead to biased outcomes that are potentially, if we use this within social media platforms, could potentially lead to censorship of voices or experiences of political ideologies that are disproportionately falsely identified through use of these tools. So I think we need to be really, really careful about relying on these detection tools. Currently, they're not accurate enough to be relied upon.
I heard you say that before, and I accept that. I think despite the fact that we're both Scottish and speak the same English, I may not have made my point properly to you. So let me have another go at this. I mean, the whole of this world of algorithms, which we're all influenced by, we all have a news app on our phones, and it serves us the news we want to hear. The football team we follow or whatever. So they know our patterns of behaviour, these algorithms, and they feed the information to us. So my point is, and I understand that in the European Union's attempt to regulate some of this behaviour, they are onto this subject. The bad operators create patterns of behaviour as well. Is there not some way in which we can use the algorithm's ability to do this to help us identify where they're operating, and we can hone in on them and stop them early in the process, as opposed to trying to catch up when they've done the damage, when they've done it and gone?
I think, there's lots of interest in how we might develop AI tools in combating online harms or in identifying malicious actors or harmful outcomes. I think that we need to be really cautious. This is an important area, and where there needs to be a lot more research to look at how we might develop tools for these kinds of purposes, or for looking at tackling malicious or harmful actions. But I think we need to be very, very cautious about relying on technical tools, relying on AI tools to address problems created by the use of AI tools. Technical tools will provide some of the solutions, but this also needs to be tackled through thinking about social, ethical, responsible innovation practices. And so I think there's a danger of relying on technical tools to address the risks created, or purely technical tools to address the risks created.
Yes, Lord Stansgate.
One quick question about...
We must then move
well,
on.
then I'll just ask quickly. You mentioned watermarks. If you print fake money, it's against the law. And the Royal Mint is constantly designing new types of note to make it more difficult for fakes and to build trust in people who use it that they're real. Do you have some hope that there could be a watermark process for digital imagery, either single images or videos? And if so, can it come quickly enough?
Yeah. Digital watermarks is again an area where there's a lot of interest into how these might be developed. Currently, some of the challenges are that these watermarks might be embedded in outputs produced by a particular model, which can then be detected by software which has been developed to detect AI-generated content produced by that particular model. But then, one of the shortcomings of this is that then potentially, if you're wanting to scrutinise whether a particular image might have been AI-generated, you might need to use lots of different AI detection softwares to see whether it's been produced by each of the various different models that those detection softwares are able to detect the outputs from. I think it's really important that this is an area where we need to really think about how we could have a joined up, coherent approach that can reliably identify AI-generated outputs across the full range of models. Where there are further risks or further limitations around this is where, as I say, malicious actors can fairly easily circumvent the compliance with digital watermarking currently, and particularly if these were being developed by use of an open source model, even if that model was developed to have a digital watermark produced on the outputs. If we're using an open source model, by altering some lines of the code, it could easily circumvent the creation of that or the embedding of that watermark into those outputs. So I think, again, this is an area where it's really important that we have more research and to be developing these techniques swiftly and rapidly. This is urgent, but at the moment these techniques can't be relied on as things currently are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we set ourselves quite a challenge today to try and get through 3 panels as smoothly and speedily as we can, and it's a challenge that we've failed. But in fairness to those who are providing the answers in the 3rd panel, I think we must thank you very much indeed, the three of you, for your contribution, and ask you to move out and let the final panel of witnesses come and give evidence.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I look forward to reading the product of your inquiry.
It'll be fake.
So do we.
The question is whether it's a convincing fake.
Get ChatGPT to do it for us.
Old Stansgate.
Yes, please.
Stephen, do you have the...
My question is very simple. What are the key threats that you think are facing democracy, and how is the Electoral Commission seeking to defend democracy in everything you do?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is week 3 for me, so forgive me if I don't know all the answers, but I have Louise Edwards with me as Director for Regulation, who has huge experience in the Electoral Commission. I was going to break down the threats into 5 areas. I think a couple have not been covered earlier in the panel, but I'll give a little response on those. And some of them are the issues you've been working through in the previous 2 panels. I just start from the position that trust in our electoral system is actually still remarkably high. So, according to our data, and we do regular surveys, 3/4 of people polled are confident elections are well run in the UK. 80% are satisfied with the process of voting. But that's obviously the end of the stage of an election. And the previous elements on information and trust in the media, we have much less information on. I think there's one large set of issues which is a real threat to that trust and to democracy, which is physical threats to candidates. And I think we've all seen a lot of that over the last few years. I'll go into a little more detail on that because the previous panels didn't. We monitor this very closely. We survey all candidates. We're going to try and step that up this year. But at the moment, between 1/3 and 1/2 of candidates who responded to our survey said they had a problem with abuse, intimidation, or harassment. And it's particularly acute, as many of you will know, for women candidates, ethnic minorities, those on the front benches, and in some parts of Northern Ireland. This is a real problem. It is making some candidates withdraw, maybe self-censor, and maybe not stand. And that seems a real threat to our democracy. So what are we doing about that? We certainly do not want to see, as it were, the victims changing their behaviour. We don't want to see self-censorship or candidates not standing because they're worried about the threats to themselves, to their families, either on or offline. So we're working very closely with the police, clearly. You'll know that we propose, and it's now entering into force, and it's in Parliament next week, that security expenditure for candidates should not count towards campaign finance. And that's in order that candidates can have what security expenditure they need without jeopardising the really tough campaign finance limits that you all know we have on candidates. We've given candidates guidance on potential criminal offences so they can draw the attention of the police and others to those offences. And from last November, anyone found guilty of these offences can be barred from standing for office, as well as the criminal sanctions. And that's partly to dissuade some of the actors, some campaigners, who are also guilty of some of the abuse as well. So there's a large set of areas around physical abuse, which is also sometimes online, and sometimes the two are intimately interlinked with harassment and abuse coming online, followed up by physical intimidation. I'll move more quickly through the others. There is a significant threat in mis- and disinformation. You've already more than touched on this. Social media companies, we know, have a lot of responsibility here. We're working really closely with Meta, with Google, with X, with Snap, with TikTok on what they can do with varying degrees of success. there is no law governing campaign material itself. So let me go into a little more detail on what we would like campaigners to do and what we hope voters will be able to do. One is voters looking at material that comes with a skeptical eye. I think they're broadly used to that. There are hundreds of years of material which was questionably truthful or accurate coming up in election campaigns as part of the process. I think they will look at it skeptically, but that needs to be reinforced even further. And campaigners themselves, I think coming back to a point raised in the earlier panel, where there have been some quite remarkable deepfakes of very senior politicians, the audio recording we all know about, is that the campaigners themselves reacted, we think, very well. When it was noted it was a deep fake, and sometimes we'll be able to attribute this, but I don't have a high expectation that technologically or quickly enough it will be possible to credibly attribute a deep fake by some third party. The campaigners themselves saying this is a deep fake and others not playing along with that will be a very important part, I think, of the behaviour. We're also keen, we proposed a while ago, and Louise, I want to say much more on this, the system of imprints for campaign material. And it is very interesting to hear your previous panellists talk about watermarks for AI. I think that would be an interesting thing to say, this is AI generated. That's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. I think what we're focused on is AI deepfakes being used to mislead voters. And that's the particular threat that we see. We are seeing examples in other parts of the world of AI being used to engage voters and engage them truthfully and helpfully. And maybe we could go into those if you'd find that useful. So there's, as I said, the physical threats, the AI threats and information. There's a big cyber threat, which I can go through quite quickly. We, the Electoral Commission, had a major attack, as you know, in 2022. Political parties have been targeted as well, as have MPs. I think that cyber threat will grow. We're working very closely with the National Cybersecurity Centre to try to make sure that all these elements of what is a form of critical national infrastructure are indeed protected to the greatest extent possible. Finally, foreign direct interference, which was raised by Professor Cormac earlier. That is always possible. We've seen plenty of examples of it around the world. I think the point that he and Pamela San Martin made, that we can learn a lot from other elections around the world in this particularly election-rich year, is really important. So we're talking to other electoral commissions and to others in other countries. The European Union obviously have European parliamentary elections coming up now. There is the US election campaign running. Our closest neighbours, there's an Irish election. There are many of these that we will be watching closely to make sure where we see a threat, where we see a new technique, we can at least look at this and be a little more prepared than when it happens to us for the first time. And the final area I just want to mention as this list of threats is finance and donations from abroad. You've touched on some of the issues there. We do think there are ways to tighten up the financing rules, and I think you've mentioned, I think Mr. Byrne mentioned at least one of them. Professor Cormac mentioned, I think, unincorporated associations and making sure that companies can't spend more money, donations, than they actually make in the UK. So those are the main threats at Sangage that we see. But set against that, we do have a system that has a high degree of resilience. It's paper-based. It's not as susceptible, as it's been said, to cyber attacks. It can be recounted. I'm sure we'll be recounting some. And it is, I hope, one which we will maintain, and that's certainly the Electoral Commission's aim, really high trust by voters, by campaigners in what's a crucial democratic moment.
Thank you very much. In view of the time, I suggest a stop. Thank you.
Okay. You made a number of recommendations to the government in 2018 and in 2021 to increase the transparency of online campaigning, which has been referred to a number of times in the evidence today. How many of those recommendations have been implemented?
A fair number, actually, and I'll go through some of them, which I'm quite pleased to see, having been one of the people who worked very hard on that report. It's fantastic that this number of years later we're still talking about it, and also some of them have come into effect as well. The number one I've mentioned is digital imprints. So that little bit of text that you see that tells you whose campaign material it is, or indeed that little bit of audio, if it's audio or something on a video. That's something that the Commission has been calling for since 2003 and eventually came into law at the back end of last year. That is something that we are very pleased to see. We'll be looking very closely about how that is complied with in the elections coming this year, and I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about that if you would like me to. We also made a series of recommendations that were aimed at how social media companies can be more transparent around the political advertising that they see on their platforms. And a lot of that was around trying to encourage the use of what are called ad libraries, so the libraries that a number of them publish that set out what political adverts have been paid for on their platforms, and any member of the public can go in and do some searching and find out what sort of money has been spent by particular political actors. One area there that we're pushing for more on, though, is trying to encourage the social media companies to bring their definitions they use around things like political advertising into line with what the legal definitions are. Because at the moment it's a bit of a Venn diagram. It's not entirely 100% that something that is regulated under law will definitely be in the ad library and vice versa as well. So that's an area we're still pushing on. I would like to just mention a couple which I know Vijay's just touched on, which have not yet come into force and that we will hopefully hope will in the future. And they are very much on the finance side. One is around encouraging political parties to have risk-based due diligence processes. You know, there are literally tens of millions of pounds going through our political system every year. In 2023, £93 million worth of donations were reported to us. There's more than £1 billion worth of donations on our website. And there's no due diligence provisions in law for the parties that are receiving them. And the second thing that I will mention is around company donations and just making sure that we're closing any loopholes and putting additional safeguards in the system around money coming in from outside the UK, which is not lawfully coming into the system.
And one of the things that strikes me, and I haven't heard anybody comment on it, is that we've got something of the order of 2 million extra overseas voters about to come into the system. And it seems to me that apart from their impact electorally, they are obviously a potential source of donations, and this may be one of the reasons the change was made. I'm not aware of any regulation that deals with that area at all.
Well, they will come into the franchise, which obviously is a matter for Parliament to decide. And having been enfranchised and entitled to be on the electoral roll, these individuals will also be entitled to make donations to political parties. So why it's always been quite important when you're talking about sort of foreign money coming into the UK political system that you talk about lawful foreign money and unlawful foreign money, because it's of course been the case since the regime was established that overseas electors can donate money into political parties. There is a regime, a structure in place around donations coming into the UK's political system. Very broadly, it's about putting a sort of wrapper around the UK of what's called permissibility, permissible individuals or permissible organisations. And there are legal obligations on political parties to take steps to identify who the donor is and to satisfy themselves that the donor is permissible. So all those newly enfranchised voters will come under that same regime, so there will still be those responsibilities on political parties. Of course, as I've mentioned, we do think that those responsibilities should be enhanced by the introduction of risk-based due diligence.
Thank you. Can I just go back to the question of disinformation and ask you what is I'm afraid, a rather sweeping question. What does it seem to you is the risk in the general election if false information remains unchallenged?
On this one? Okay, first of all, one of the risks that we've already mentioned is around people actually wanting to get stuck into the election in the first place. Now, one of the fundamental building blocks of our democracy is people who are willing to campaign and stand as candidates, political parties, non-party campaigners and candidates. And if false information or the fear of risk of false information puts people off becoming candidates, wanting to campaign, wanting to volunteer for their local political party, then that is a huge and significant and very unfortunate impact. Now, there's another category of information that could be wrong, and that's information around the electoral processes. In fact, in the local elections last year, we did see some leaflets being distributed that had the wrong forms of voter ID on them, meaning that somebody relying on those leaflets may have turned up to the polling station and not have been able to vote. Now, fortunately, in this country, there is a trusted source of information about electoral processes, which would be us. And therefore, if there are questions about false information around electoral processes, we will be able to say whether it's right or wrong, and we will be able to mobilise our social media channels and our partners, including sort of media partners, to make sure that it's very clear that that piece of disinformation about the electoral process is wrong. If we move on to more sort of campaign-based disinformation, or the deep fakes that have been discussed here a number of times, we're in a similar situation to some of the people who've spoken to you before. There isn't a legal framework around the content of campaign material distributed by parties or campaigners. So we are in the space of encouraging voters to look at the situation critically and to try and understand what they can do to check the veracity of information that they see. We work not just ourselves, but with a lot of other regulators, including Ofcom, actually, to do this and to signpost people to where they can find information about how to verify whether something is truthful or not. And we look to campaigners to call it out themselves, and the resilience of political parties and campaigners themselves to try and work in this space. But there isn't a law that we can enforce here, so these are the mechanisms that we use.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Mr. Byrne for the final question in a moment, but it struck me listening to this afternoon that there's a general observation that people make about commercial transactions, which is, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And maybe this is an attitude we should encourage more generally. Mr. Byrne.
Thanks very much indeed, Chair. So I think it's about 1.2 billion in donations are now recorded in the Electoral Commission database. Am I right in saying a significant fraction of that is from quite a small number of individuals?
Well, I honestly wouldn't know, actually. I'd have to interrogate the database to find out.
Well, you'd be there for a long time, because the way that the information is recorded in the database is not standardised by name, for example. So an individual may be recorded in one name with one donation, or they could also be listed by 4 or 5 other names, for example, the use of initials, for example. So it's actually really difficult. I say that having done it myself, but a significant fraction, maybe 25% of electoral donations, are from a very, very small number of people. But it is still the case, is it not, that money from a foreign source can go into the bank account of a UK citizen and can then go into a political party as a donation perfectly legally?
Well, that would depend on whether or not there was an agency situation in case. So there is a provision called the agency law, which is where somebody acts as an agent for another person. So if somebody were to say, hey, give me the money and I'll give it on your behalf, you're creating an agency situation there. That would be illegal. That would be a matter for the police to investigate.
If you took the example flagged by the New York Times in 2022 of about $630,000 coming from Russian bank accounts into the bank account of a UK citizen and then going on to a major political party here, was there an agency problem involved in that donation?
So I am aware of the donation that you're talking about. Agency provisions are provisions that can only be investigated by law enforcement, not by the Electoral Commission. However, we did make inquiries at the time, and we had no reason to think that we needed to use our enforcement powers.
And the source of some of this money was, of course, businesses in occupied Crimea.
We didn't need to use our enforcement powers, so I haven't investigated that matter.
But the loophole was obviously there because the money was transferred.
Again, we didn't investigate it, so I don't know the exact circumstances in that situation. But you are right to point out that there are areas of electoral law, of the finance provisions, which can be tightened up. And we've mentioned some of them before, the due diligence provisions, looking at how companies can make donations. And we can also touch on unincorporated associations as well. So those are the areas which we really do recommend are looked at very strongly to see where additional safeguards can be placed.
In between elections, there aren't really spending limits that bite.
No, that's right. The spending limits are tied to what's called a regulated period. So for a parliamentary general election, for political parties and campaigners, that's 365 days, ending with polling day. We are in a regulated period now. We must be, no matter when the general election is held. And for candidates, it's different. There are long campaigns and short campaigns that have different spending limits attached to them.
There's that old saying that you can't fatten a pig on market day, and so for political parties, there's an incentive to spend significantly in between regulated periods, and at the moment there's no cap on that spending.
There's no cap on the spending outside of regulated periods. Of course, if the spending happens before a regulated period but is used for campaigning during it, it is caught again by the law. But no, what Parliament has done has put spending limits in place in a period of time running up to a poll.
So between regulated periods, I could spend that money on, for example, social media, and there could be algorithms that promote some of that social media to the top of people's feeds. But at the moment, we don't have any transparency around those algorithms.
That would be correct.
And at the moment, there is nobody who is actually checking the content of a political message, and we've just heard from Ofcom that they have no powers to do so.
Parliament hasn't put a legal framework around that.
So as we sit here today, we've also heard that there are unlikely to be any safeguards in place around the creation, for example, of deepfakes until before the end of the year. Is that your understanding too?
Well, we're not aware of any legislation going through Parliament on that at this time.
Okay, so we've got a situation then where it's still permissible for significant amounts of money to come into the bank account of a UK citizen and then into a political party. There is no limit on how much money like that can be spent between regulated periods, and there's no one checking the content that that money is spent on.
Well, again, with money coming in, there is a provision in law that's what's called the agency provision, which it would be a matter for the police to investigate if they thought that there was evidence of agency having taken place. So putting to one side an actual criminal offence being committed, you find yourself in the regime that Parliament has decided, which is that spending limits only apply up to a sort of a period before a poll. But what I would highlight, though, is that actually we do have one of the most transparent political finance systems in the world. So spending, when it does happen in the run-up to elections, is provided to us in itemised spending returns, tens of thousands of individual lines of spending, millions of pounds worth of spending that then all gets published on our website and is transparent for everyone to see. There's also statements of accounts that come in every year so you can see the income and expenditure going into political parties. And crucially, there are contact details for every political party on our register to ask questions.
We all have agents who have to sweat and fill those forms in. But how many investigations or prosecutions have there been for this sin of agency?
Well, we wouldn't investigate it or prosecute it because it is a criminal prosecution and Parliament decided to remove our power to prosecute. But I am aware of, I think, one instance of convictions that happened in 2021. This is why, when Parliament was considering the bill to remove our powers to prosecute criminal offences, we did say that had to go hand in hand with really good discussions with the police and with the Home Office around how they would ensure that the police were equipped to take up this area.
So we can route significant amounts of money into the bank accounts of UK citizens from foreign nationals, and that money can go on to UK political parties. You're right that there is one barrier to prevent that, which is this issue of agency, but we've only had one prosecution by the sound of it. You can spend pretty much whatever you like between regulated periods and no one will check the content that you're spending the money on, and nor can we look into the algorithms that might put that content to the top of somebody's social media feed. That's broadly accurate.
I would dispute some of the claims there because actually what you're talking about is criminal offences that may well be committed. However, if there are gaps in the electoral framework, the political finance framework that you're highlighting here, that's something we'd be very interested to explore and to see what recommendations we could make to Parliament to try and improve and close those gaps.
Well, I'm struggling to see the things I've got wrong in that description, but maybe you could highlight what you think the gaps are in the electoral law that Parliament should attend to if we want to defend our democracy with some stronger defences.
Absolutely. So we've mentioned some of them already today, and Vijay may want to come in with some others, but we've mentioned things around the political finance system where we could consider due diligence, enhanced due diligence for political parties, and you've asked a finance question, so I think that's quite relevant. We've talked about company transactions coming through from outside of the UK. We've touched on the concept of unincorporated associations and their ability to get donations from outside the UK and, provided there's no agency relationship, to then pass that on. We've also touched a little bit on what we think should be and hopefully are very meaningful conversations with the police, making sure that they are well equipped and well resourced to pick up these challenges, particularly when they're criminal offences only. There are also a number of other recommendations that we would encourage Parliament to look at, set out in our digital campaigning report of 2018 and other places, to really make sure that we can enhance the safety and security of our electoral system. However, I do come back to what Vijay said at the very start, which is that actually our electoral system is very highly trusted, and there are very high levels of confidence in the public that our electoral system is well run, and that's something that we really do need to safeguard.
Just my final point, if I may, because I know we're so short of time, Chair. At the moment, a company, for example, headquartered and registered in Gibraltar, could also make a donation to a UK citizen who could put the money into a political campaign or indeed into a political party. At the moment, the opacity on the accounting system in, say, for example, Gibraltar, makes it impossible to actually trace the fountainhead of that cash. Is that something that we should also tighten up when we are thinking about the way that we work with foreign countries or indeed overseas territories too?
Forgive me, but as the Director of Regulation for the UK Electoral Commission, I don't think I'm in a position to be talking about sort of transparency of Gibraltar or organised or countries.
If the money is
outside
laundered
of the UK.
from Russian sources into company accounts in, say, for example, Gibraltar, and is then pushed into the bank accounts of UK citizens, that is a problem.
I feel like I might end up repeating myself, so I'm going to let Vijay answer.
Thanks, Chair.
Mr. Mayor, I just wonder if I could add one point, which is one of the recommendations we made, which I think is germane to the challenge, which I quite understand. And this was picked up in the Elections Act. It was to put effectively almost a prohibition on people and organisations who are not eligible to register as a third-party campaigner, including foreign organisations, spending more than £700 on campaign activity. Now, clearly that falls very much within the campaign periods. But in effect, in that entire period, which, as Louise has said, starts a year before a general election anyway, a foreign organisation transferring that money in is committing an offence because they're effectively not allowed to be a third-party campaigner. And they can't spend more than £700 is the limit. That actually came down significantly. But Louise, I want to expand a little more on that. I think some of the methods for getting money into our system that you're describing are basically trying to either defraud by a political party accepting a donation that it knows has not come from the person who is donating. And the reason, just to expand on this, that Louise was explaining why parties could more uniformly, some do so very well, by the way, but parties could more uniformly look behind their donors and do a full due diligence on them, is exactly to try to prevent a kind of chain reaction of someone trying to channel money into them. They do a lot, and you're aware of the kind of work that agents do in for campaigners. But there is, particularly for the larger donations, and hence the importance of the risk-based approach, looking right behind that. If they were to find a non-permitted donation, it would be an offence to
I take that point, but having tried to pursue this with the Electoral Commission in 2018, we very quickly ran into the Electoral Commission's lack of investigative capacity, and so we ended up having to give up, despite some pretty well-founded suspicions that significant amounts of money were in effect laundered through foreign governments and foreign accounts into a political campaign that actually had quite a significant bearing on the course of our country's future. So unless you've got not just powers but also the investigation capacity, frankly, we're not necessarily going to have the defences that we need. But Chair, I've overrun your patience already.
And we've all rather overrun.
Can I ask one quick factual question?
Yes.
As a result of the change in the law, how many additional electors based outside the UK are going to be taking part in this election this year, or whenever it is?
We don't know.
You don't know?
They can still register. And obviously, right up until, I don't know exactly how far before a general election, they are still able to register. What we do know is where they're registering, electoral registration officers, and despite being very hard-pressed people, are taking a lot of trouble to check that they're actually eligible to register. And that there are lists, and we were actually in a meeting earlier today running through some of the reasons why someone had moved away when they were 2 years old. They claimed they had lived in a certain area, but they really couldn't prove it. EROs are going to a lot of trouble to try to make sure that that person can be registered if they have a reasonable claim, but they're checking every one. It's proving quite a lot of work for them. There could be quite a significant number of people joining the electoral register, but until we're actually through for the parliamentary general election, we won't know exactly how many. But we'll be looking at some of that, and we're looking now at exactly what data is useful to do in our post-poll reporting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your evidence and for your patience in us overrunning.
Pleasure to be here.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.